This is the Working in Hell podcast with your host, Vinny Blasio. Each episode, Vinny takes you inside the world of New York State Corrections, focusing on both corrections officer and law enforcement issues. And now your host, Vinny Blasio.
Hey, hello, everyone. This is Vinny Blasio with the Working in Hell podcast. Just wanted to let you know that today we're going to have a special guest. His name is Patrick Vaccaro, and we'll be having him giving us some special feedback on some of the things that are going on within NYSDOCCS. He has an extensive background, both within working in the correctional system, and I'll let him speak truth to that, and also union experience, as well as he continued being in the law enforcement realm even after he retired. Pat and I have gone way back. So in a minute, we're going to have Patrick come on and give us his insight. So right now, I just wanted to play a little clip for everybody. This is what is going on in Minnesota. The volume is a little low. I apologize for that. But this just gives you, with some of the recent exposures that we had, this goes into the K2 and it's going to be a little spot on of what's recently happened here. But you can see the difference of what's going on with NYSDOCCS, how they handle the thing in New York State, and how the commissioner right away goes out and about the Stillwater prison, goes out and talks about what's happening. He doesn't mince words. He doesn't blame it on anybody. He takes responsibility, goes into what's happening with the department. And it's kind of a refreshing approach. Not that I necessarily agree with everything that's going on in Minnesota, but it kind of contrasts different agencies and how they work. And I'll play the quick 2-minute video here, and we'll play that now for you.
Prison. 9 employees were taken to the hospital after officials say they were exposed to drugs. One of them was treated with Narcan. Jonah Kaplan joins us live in St. Paul, where authorities just gave an update, Jonah.
Aaron, these were all correctional officers at the Stillwater Correction Facility, and we just learned a lot of details from the commissioner himself, confirming what we had heard from correction officers at Stillwater, and that is, early this morning, there was an inmate, and he was smoking what appeared to be an unknown substance and turned out to be a synthetic narcotic, and as staff approached him, they started to inhale some of those fumes, and that's when they started feeling lightheaded, started getting nauseous, and that is when they fell ill, and that is when they needed some treatment. Then in the same cell block, as things were getting locked down, an inmate threw a milk carton, and inside the milk carton could have been some other illicit materials that also gave off some fumes, exposed other staff, and more of them fell ill. 8 people had to be taken to the hospital via ambulance, and then a 9th took himself or herself. This is something that we've been covering. WCCO Investigates has been looking at for a number of months now. And listen now, as the commissioner says, they continue to play catch up, even if they are looking at the mail. And we've seen examples of paper stained with this illicit material. Now it's still almost impossible to detect.
It's liquefied. It ultimately gets soaked into paper that does not show any watermarks. That paper then can be used to submit letters from people on the outside, gets sent in through the mail, and that can be torn up into small pieces, and that can end up being distributed to people, and that's what's being smoked.
All 9 of those corrections officers were treated and released from the hospital. One, we understand, was already back at work, according to correction officers we spoke with in Stillwater. Just spoke with the commissioner one-on-one. He told me that the prison will remain on lockdown through tomorrow, probably until Saturday morning as well.
Okay, so that just gives you a little bit of the K2 problem that they're talking about with contraband coming in the facility. But as you can see, the commissioner, in his own words, besides the newscasters giving their take on it and getting a lot of detail from the department themselves, they don't deny that there's a problem. They don't deny that it's coming through and coming through the package room or coming through mail. They're not denying or saying that we don't know what it is yet. And then here it is 8 weeks later and we still don't know anything. Right from the very beginning, they take responsibility for it, own it, and say what is going on. So that's a little refreshing. So I just wanted to bring that because that kind of follows up on where we were last week at our podcast. So without any further ado, let's bring Patrick back. Let's bring him up to the podcast. Hey, good morning, Patrick. How are you?
Good morning, Ben. Doing good.
All right. So if you could just tell the listeners, just give a little bit of bio, a little history about yourself, and we'll kind of take it from there.
I started corrections through the advice of a friend of mine who was already working in the prison system. He started just before the strike in '79, and that was pretty much right after the riot, actually. And the guards were still looking for pay, looking for benefits. They were looking for training, and there was still overcrowding going on. So took the job in the '80s, and here I am today. I survived 26 years in the system. I got a lot of great stories, a few scars, a few bumps and bruises, but I'm here and I'm enjoying life with my grandchild, and we'll go from there.
Oh, that's very good. Good to hear somebody that actually appreciate going back. Obviously, as you always told me, you had more time on the job than I did. So but could give a little background on the facilities that you worked at, just to give a little perspective on the medium versus max, and just to give a little background of that you didn't just work in a medium or just in a max.
Correct. I started out at Attica, and young kid full of piss and vinegar, and like so many of us. That was the mid 80s. So I think I got into Attica in '85, and first 2 weeks there, I seen probably more things that most humanity don't see in a lifetime. And we kind of looked at each other and said, hey, are we going to do this for the rest of our lives, or are we going to be, but the pay was good. The benefits were good. We had families to raise, and we stuck it out. And I think my first big job was in C Block, and it was known as the Snake Pit. And it was known as the Snake Pit because it was a snake pit, and nobody wanted to work there. It was some of the worst, most violent prisoners that they had no place else to stick, so they stuck them there. I took a shot at it, and I wound up working there for quite a few years, and I got a few scars there. But my next step was up into the box, SHU at Attica, and that was another place nobody wanted to work, because that was also a pretty treacherous place. And that was the reason I went to the box, was because I was able to bump to day shift, and that was a premium shift. You couldn't get on the shift, but because it was the box, nobody wanted to work it. They stuck me up there. But and that's where I started getting involved in a lot of union stuff and a lot of political stuff. And I actually had a lieutenant one time tell me when I was up in the box, he says, Vaccaro, you're fighting windmills. I was a little bit outspoken, a little bit radical, He says, you're fighting windmills. Yeah, well, maybe I was, but he gave me some good advice, and eventually I learned to pick my battles. And you got to pick your battles. You can't fight everything. I was fighting everything, but you had to pick your battles. And one of the biggest battles was the human waste assaults that were going on up in the box, and it was bad. It smelled like the smell you can never get out of your mind. It was just impermeated into your mind, your nose, your body. It was just terrible. And let me think here. I'm going to get a point of thought here. You might have to dub this.
No, we're live. But one of the things that you touched on, one of the as far as
Yeah,
which
direction do you want me to keep going in? You know?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really good point, because even though it still happens today, it has a different effect because you were instrumental in that law. So if you want to touch on, a lot of people, especially the public, and the public does listen to the podcast, what you're talking about kind of goes over their head, because, to speak to, when we used to wear raincoats just to walk down the gallery, and then the law that you actually helped effectuate that change.
Yeah, that was a big thing then. Like I said, we decided we'd have to start lobbying some of the people down in Albany, and that was a little bit trick. We were nervous about it, but my first couple trips down to Albany to get in there and explain to these people what was going on, because nobody really knew what was going on in the prison systems. I mean, guards were coming out of there every night, every other night, with their uniforms in plastic bags covered in feces and urine, and they smelled, and they went home. You take a shower, you can't get rid of that smell. It was in their eyes. I mean, nobody wanted to hear about what was going on. I mean, you couldn't. The department kind of was just hoping that it would go away. They just, whatever, let it go away. And this was at the height of the AIDS epidemic, which complicated things more, because human waste assault, blood to blood contact, diseases, guys didn't know what to expect. And so we went down and talked to some of these people. And at first we were being nice. It's a little bit of feces and urine being thrown on us. And they were like, well, a little feces and urine. They couldn't put it in their head that it was that bad. Well, the next time I went into somebody, I got a little more graphic. I said, well, this is what they do. They fill their 2-gallon wash pails up with shit for months, and they mix it with piss and urine and body fluids, and they let it sit there, and they put a towel over it and let it sit there, and they wait till they get a good shot to dump it on somebody, and that is traumatic. I mean, and not just one guy doing it; the whole gallery was doing it. They're filling their styrofoam cups up with shit and piss and body fluids and God knows what else. And that's what they used to get their wreck off. And there was no repercussions, nothing you could do to these guys. It was their way of getting wrecked. So once we explained it a little more colorfully, it was like, wow, really? This is what's going on. It was Nozzolio, Senator Nozzolio out of Auburn, Finger Lakes area, who sponsored that first human waste assault bill. And we got a little momentum that way. And we continued to fight the assaults up there. I mean, there were days where we had to it smelled so bad up there. And they gave us a power washer. The state said, here, give these guys a power washer to clean these galleries, because nobody would make rounds up there. The depths, they come up, they take a good whiff. They were gone. They didn't want to be up there. Like I said, nobody wanted to be up there. It was bad. Civilians, nurses, I could bring in coworkers and tell you the same thing. And we'd have to get dressed up literally in raincoats with shields on. And we had the power washer, and we, go down the gallery and spray it all day long. You still couldn't get rid of the smell. You couldn't get the species out of their cells unless you opened every cell. You couldn't go in there and fight with these guys. They stacked it up in styrofoam cups above their cell. And we just went through it, and you got immune to it, desensitized to it, so to speak. And then we decided maybe we better take this to the press. So I got a contact up at the Democratic Chronicle, which covered a lot of stuff and incidents out of Attica. So I actually set up a meeting with this female investigative reporter. We went out, we met at a little hotel somewhere, quiet, and I explained to her, she just let me talk like I'm doing now, and I explained to her what's going on and described it in detail. And she was pretty sickened by some of the stuff that I had told her, So she printed an article, and she did a nice job. It was a good article. She was pretty graphic. And the next morning, I see the newspaper on the desk in the chart office, and some of the captains were kind of looking at it and say, who is this anonymous source? And you couldn't say anything, obviously, because you would be disciplined if you said anything, and they weren't all against us. They just wanted to keep it quiet. So that went over pretty good with some of the politicians. They're starting to say, hey, what's going on here? And they wanted to start looking a little deeper. About maybe 6 months after that article came out, we got a contact in the Buffalo News. And that was our kind of our big break. I don't remember the reporter's name, but we wound up meeting at a local bar in Buffalo. He listened to our story. He listened to all our grievances, and he wrote a front page of the local news article explaining some of the things that we had to go through back in the mid 80s and early 90s. And it was good. And that kind of broke the ice, and we got some legislation, and it helped. It helped a lot, and compared to what these kids are going through today. I mean, they got to step out of the box. They got to start thinking out of the box, and they got to get out there and fight for themselves. Talk to the politicians. Talk to the press. And it takes everybody. They got to get out. I feel for these guys today, because it's there's nothing worse than having to go to prison and worry about getting assaulted. I mean, you have that kind of assault that you got to take home to your family. You can't get rid of it. You really can't. It's a shame.
No, that is a shame. And you brought up a really good point. And that kind of goes back to, what we were talking about before in other podcasts. Obviously you were instrumental in you and others. And for those that don't know, Pat was also involved in the formation of NYSDOCCS and had a lot to deal with both unions at the time. And then obviously NYSDOCCS was formed, and Pat was on the original certificate of incorporation for NYSDOCCS. So for those that don't know the history, but also for those that are newer in the department, that don't know the history, and that seems to be a lot of problem. You brought up a good point as far as the assaults, and a lot of the people, whether it be union members, whether it be the union itself, whether it be the officers, supervisors, civilians, it doesn't matter the title, they forget the history. So it's kind of like you're starting from scratch every single time, because as the older generation kind of goes away that already fought these battles, that you're fighting the same fights over and over again. And DOCCS, just like I started the podcast earlier, is so antiquated with its ways. And Pat will remember, because when we were both officers at Gowanda, we had to fight just to get a simple fax machine. And we finally were successful at the end, but they just wouldn't give us any way to communicate on purpose. And the other point that you made is very well taken, as far as DOCCS is very heavy-handed with discipline as far as leaking stuff out to the press, or speaking out in name and giving out trade secrets, so to speak, because DOCCS does not want obviously internal stuff. It was operational, I get it, but to give out your concerns, I don't get. But that for the younger generation that's now in corrections, that have the throwing bill, that efforts that you did obviously led to the throwing bill becoming a penalty for the convicts, we called them back then, but now incarcerated individuals, with a new, kinder, gentler term.
Well, that was through the big expansion years. So the system was growing. So that was to our advantage. I mean, there was, the prisons were being built, mediums were being built, guys were getting hired, and that was to our advantage. Things obviously have changed, and now they're closing. Now they're closing prisons. But some of the stuff we got, like it is cyclical. When I first started up in the box, we used to do cell extractions. And in my first couple of cell extractions, we went in there with, I called it a number 5 tuna can for a helmet and a plastic shield that was so flexible and flimsy. I went in there, I got my nose cracked. The shield didn't stop nothing. I had scars, scratches, and it was like, what are we doing? We're fighting. These guys are some of the worst outlaws in the state, and we're nothing, But I got to give props, one of these cert lieutenants sat down with us and he said, "What do you guys need? What do you guys need?" So we actually sat down and said, "This is what we need. We need some better equipment. Let's find out what we need." We wound up getting hockey equipment. We had these Joe for shoulder pads, elbow pads, helmets. We had the big shirt helmets with the masks and gloves, and we were getting dressed up. We felt like we were ready to go to war. And you know what? The first time we walked down the gallery with this stuff on, it was like they were like, "What the hell is going on?" But those were the type of changes before and after. That was a good change. And now they use that type of equipment on all the CERT teams, all the cell extraction teams. I learned from the guys that were from the riot. The guy worked side by side with guys that were hostages, guys that were in the riot and worked. They had 40 years on the job when I was working, and guys from the strike. And those guys were a wealth of knowledge. I mean, they were supportive, and they told you go out there and you fight for your rights. They wanted us to speak up. Go ahead, don't. They did their time. They bled for their families. They were the ones that encouraged us. They said, "Listen, kid, go out there and fight. Tell the people, tell the news your story." And that's kind of, it's cyclical. That's what's sociology 101. That's what's going on. The guys gotta take the ball and run with it today.
And a lot has changed, and their hands are tied. But I agree. I mean, a lot of people that are in the current situation that they're in, they feel that their hands are tied, but they have a lot more power than what they realize. And I think a lot of that is by design, because if they could shut you up back then obviously they're still going to try to do that today. But one of the things that compounds the issue back then, like I said, you effectuated for the change with the throwing bill and were successful with others to getting that done. But the problem you have today is that there's so many legislators and state politicians, not all, because obviously with the recent rallies, we've brought a lot of attention and people got a lot of support, including the union that held the rally. So at least in Western New York, they seem to be supportive of law enforcement. But when you see some of these crazy bills, and we've talked, and we're going to keep talking about HALT. Last podcast, I brought out the assault numbers with the chart from DOCCS's own website. It's hard to believe that, the commissioner, I just can't imagine. We've had some bad commissioners going back to Brian Fisher and whatever, but the old school commissioners that we had with Coughlin, and we go back to Glenn Gord, though we might not always agree with their stance, they would stick up to the governor and say, "You cannot do this to us, because if you cut staff, if you do these crazy policies, you're going to lose a jail, and I'm not going to be responsible for losing a jail." Would you agree with that?
100%. 100%. I mean, what goes on in society goes on in the prisons. And I think that is the biggest problem, the HALT. I mean, you have to hold these convicts accountable. I mean, you can't let them run the prison systems like they are now. I mean, that is the biggest problem. And it sounds like the commissioner you got there is a little bit of a problem. So maybe that's where you have to go, And of course, your governor isn't much better either. So that's a tough challenge, but these you gotta keep moving. You gotta keep putting the word out there. Let these kids know, like this might be good for some of these young guys to say, well, there was a history there. Maybe we could make a change. What you're doing is great, because you're advocating for these kids to get out there and tell their story. It's a big thing.
Well, it's great to see yourself. We had David Washburn on before. We're going to have Rick Harkrell coming on in the next week or two. So we're going to have some retirees that are going to be speaking about it. And it's really good to be able to see the retirees, advocating for those that are still working when we could be far off. Go ahead.
It's funny you mentioned Rick, because when I told you that story about when we first started, we looked at each other after we got a dumbbell going here, a alarm going this way. We got guards going one way, guards going the other way. Boom, boom, back. C block, A block. You got people on gurneys. You got people out of breath. We looked at it. Rick was one of the guys. He looked at me, and he had like a couple of weeks more than me, so he had some time on the job, you know. And I'll get together with Rick, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he said, "Hey, kid, what are we gonna do, man? Is this what we're gonna do for the rest of our lives?" And the next week we were doing the same thing. It was like the cartoon, good morning, Sam. It was, you know what? And you know what? In the end, it was a blessing because the brotherhood, the unity, you can't beat it. No matter who you are, I don't care what kind of person you were. If you stepped into that maximum security jail and you put in 8-hour shift, you get credit, because a lot of people, when they walk in for the first time, they'll turn around and they walk out and never want to go back in again. So hands off to them guys. And speaking of that, we do the Attica reunion now that we just started. Scotty Womer and a couple other guys started it, and it's been great. 3 years running now. We've been doing it with the Attica Preservation Society helping out, and it's a great thing because it brings us together every year to share what we shared that nobody else does. There's always a stigma attached to being a correction officer, and this is a great thing, and hopefully we'll continue. And maybe you could even do something like that with some of the guys from the Preservation Society, or so we got ideas we could share with you, and we're willing to work with you, Ben. I hope everything works good for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the premise. Obviously, a lot of times I didn't out of state, so I wasn't able to make it this year. But usually the only time that I get to see everyone is at the Attica Memorial, which was just last week, as everyone knows. And it's the only time, sad situation, to get everybody together. So that's good to see that, on a little happier note, that everyone is able to get together and tell their stories. The one of the things that you mentioned, though, was, as far as advocacy, if I could spit that out correctly. And nobody is a better advocate, just like you learned when you were still working. Nobody's a better advocate than yourself. So, the retirees are obviously right now, I think, that one of the voices. And I've said this 1,000 times. Everybody should be together. There shouldn't be one in place of another. But nobody's a bigger advocate than yourselves. And all the people that are still working should be continually advocating for themselves, whether it's making situational awareness or something with their families. I do understand, just like before when you said it, that the same holds true today with docs, is that they recently distributed a social media policy and said you can't talk, and reminded everybody what the restrictions are, though I don't necessarily agree with all that. But it does scare the new generation of officers into feeling that he or she cannot speak to the public or can't speak out against their working conditions.
That's a big piece too, because the prison system, the psychology of it changes you as a person. I don't care who you are. You have a different mentality, a different personality, and it's when you can't speak to anybody, when you can't talk to anybody. I can remember comments my ex-mother-in-law said about how you treat people like inmates. What are you talking about? But you're working 7 days a week. Sometimes when you're working doubles, these kids that are working overtime, that's gonna be the worst thing happening, man. You can't do that. You can't take that and come home. I seen the one interview with the one girl. She had no time for her family. She come home and she couldn't sleep, and she's stressed out. You can't take that. That's a big problem, and hopefully that'll get addressed. I know there's a lot of good guys that I work with that can attest to that, and be more than willing to help you share some of these comments, out to out to the people there. You know, if they can't speak, well, maybe we could speak for them. You know, that's
Yeah.
my.
And that's obviously that's the whole point of these podcasts. That's a lot of
Right.
the letters that we've written, and a lot of the things that we're doing is speaking out, and just not, speaking for ourselves, but speaking for those and being the voice, and them retelling their stories through us, because they cannot.
Right. Exactly. Yep. Very good, man.
Yeah, a lot of it is in the sleep portion is just so much. I mean, you're already sleep deprived, and we all know what that takes a toll on its body, and we all know that you're already working in a stressful environment. Some facilities more than others, depending on how they're run, but not, it doesn't matter what facility that you're in. They keep working in those conditions is not healthy for anyone. You add the stress of the normal life of day-to-day corrections. Now you compound it because of the conditions of halt, and then you add to that you're working, like you said, 7 days a week, sometimes 24 hours. I just don't know how the human body can keep sustaining that. And then you go home to maybe a husband or a wife that doesn't necessarily understand it. And sometimes they do understand it, because both partners are in corrections, and it makes for a disastrous home life. I just can't wrap my head around that portion of it. I get that they're short staffed, but that's a problem that they created within themselves, let alone the whole, defund the police, making the law enforcement villains. But let's be honest, you and I both know from our other experiences outside of corrections, we spoke to law enforcement and they wouldn't do our job.
Yeah, exactly. No, you're right. When we worked, I can't believe it, And you know what? Who's in jail now? You got to have just about a body to be in jail. They're all out on the streets. So whoever you got in there, they got to be the worst of the worst of the worst. And that's one of the first things that I remember when I first walked into the jail, first walked into Attica, when that steel door closed behind you. The first image that you get in your head is, this is humanity. When I seen these images walking paired up at Attica, side by side, you could just see that these people were the worst of the worst. They didn't belong out in the streets. They were like from a horror movie. You could just see it in their face. They were bad people, and that feeling just goes right through you, and you have to learn how to survive. How am I going to survive in this environment? And that mentality, that psychology takes over. And I better end it, or else I'm going to have PTSD, and I'm going to have something else besides coffee in the morning. And you're laughing too, but that's what we had to do. We had to laugh. We had some crazy days, but we had to laugh. We had to bust each other's balls, because you broke the ice, you broke the tension. The guys I carpool with, we laughed our asses off. We laughed our asses off. So Greg Lindstrom used to say, "Carl, you're the funniest son of a bitch I've ever worked with." Now he's in Florida, living the good life in his beautiful home and enjoying himself. But we paid our dues.
Yes, above and beyond. But that's a coping mechanism too. When we had a lot of good people that we worked
absolutely.
And it was always a good, like you said at the very beginning, a good brotherhood. Everybody took care of each other. And I don't know what the answer is for today, but I mean, we certainly did have a lot of good times, and a lot of characters.
No doubt. We could tell stories. We could tell stories all day long, but it was glad you hooked up with me, and we got to do this. It's been really good.
Well, thank you for joining us. Like I said, I just wanted to be able to have some insight and let the listeners and viewers know and hear it from someone that's not just myself speaking, and know that they have a friend in you and another advocate to help tell their story. And like I said before, for those that don't know, Pat, he's done his whole career with not just helping himself, without getting into too much detail. He's given his family. He's given up time with his family in support of trying to do things for others, and we certainly appreciate that, Pat.
Well, you got some good guys lined up, so I'm always willing to help and go from there. So I appreciate it, Vin. Keep up the good work. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you again for joining us
Enjoy
today.
your little road trip tonight.
I'm going to love that. I'll be going to Tampa tonight, so
very good. Good.
I'll be going to the Creed concert. So got a little drive ahead of me. So, but stay in touch, and then we'll be again, and hopefully you'll join us again with some of your I like to call them good stories.
Yeah,
and
definitely. Awesome job, Jen. All right.
Thank you, Pat.
Sounds good, Vin. Take care.
All right, take care. So there we go. We have Mr. Vaccaro, as he told you that his little background, and Pat and I had worked together for many years at Gowanda when I got there, and Pat got there, and we were there for a long time until Patrick retired, and then Pat and I also worked together outside of corrections as well. So he's a good friend. He's a good advocate. And if anybody wants to reach out to him for his, and we'll have Patrick on again, because he does have some really good stories. So we'll get into something that maybe we can clean up for podcast air, and be able to share some of those stories. So with that, we're going to go with leaving it again with how the situations are. I wanted to get back to the K2 incident that we saw with Minnesota, and obviously in a different facility. Minnesota's got some problems too, just like the rest of the nation. When we're coming into assaults, Michigan just had a inmate stab officers, so it's not isolated to New York. It's how you deal with that. And as Pat said earlier, we're dealing with something different with the HALT. We're dealing with a legislative body, not any one in particular, that has a different mindset, and it doesn't coincide with the directions that the officers need, and it doesn't coincide with protecting the officers. And the same can be said with the governor. A lot of people criticize me that I'm a little too hard on the department when the department is acting within the guidelines, and that is true to an extent. But the way, as you can see, the way that Minnesota is doing it, you don't have a boss that tries to hide, deflect, and he was front and center. As soon as that K2 incident was out, it wasn't hid behind a press secretary, wasn't hid behind the public information officer at DOCCS. He didn't, he stepped right up to the microphone, said, "This is what we got. This is what we're doing." I mean, he locked it down. They called it a temporary lockdown, but what did they do? They locked the jail down. You don't see that in some of the other facilities that had the incident. And then, as we talked about before with the incident in Western New York, you had two different facilities have it. They wouldn't even come out and say what the toxic substance was, though the superintendent put out a memo, internal memo, stating what it was. But they still to this day won't give out the details. But then you have Minnesota commissioner of their correction department and coming out and saying, "This is what we believe it is. This is the steps that we're taking." And they locked the jail down. They locked the prison down. How, I just can't, the new way of DOCCS's involvement. You don't need the legislative permission to lock down a jail. You don't need the governor's permission to go and lock down a jail. It should be automatically done. And then when you don't do things, and another incident happens a week later, there's a problem. And it's not isolated to just one facility, because you're looking at different facilities having issues. It happened, we talked about another incident that happened at Fishkill. We talked about a different incident that happened at Wyoming, and I can keep going and going and going. We talked about, the inmates chanting. I won't get into too much detail because I've seen some videos that are just downright disturbing of what's going on. And you take a look and see the brazen moves of the inmate during movements and holding end gates open when the officers are trying to close it. I mean, it's disturbing. And way of what Pat was saying before is, yeah, we got thrown on. We had it. Not that throwing still doesn't happen today. It just doesn't happen in the number of instances like it used to, because there was a bill that passed that made it a crime to throw on staff. And that did have an effect. Did it stop it? No, it didn't stop it completely, but it didn't. The number of incidents went down. The correlation is definitely there. The case could be made for that. And the same could be true today. If they'd repeal HALT, you would see the number of incidences going down. But again, what I'm talking about with the department is you have a department that has a different mindset. So to say that they get a pass, I'm not a believer that they get a pass. Yeah, I'm not a believer in the same antiquated ideas and ideology and the management saying this is what we have to do, and we're going to keep doing things the same way. Well, what's the old saying that if you keep doing things the same way and you keep banging your head against the wall, why would you expect a different result? I mean, that's the same thing. And I've said it every podcast, and I'll say it again. It's my mantra that you cannot have the people solve the problems they created it. It's just impossible, because they have to take responsibility, and they're not taking any responsibility. They want to blame staff. They want to blame everything else but where the responsibility lies. So just like we just saw with that clip that I played from Minnesota, and if anybody wants that, I have that saved. I'd be happy to send it to you in your email, and it's available online for a CBS Minnesota, I believe. So you look at that, but no time was wasted. The incident happened, I believe, at 7:45 in the morning. The jail was locked down. They were searching for the contraband to make sure that the contraband didn't spread. Could docs learn something from that? Have they ever locked down a jail before? Of course they have. But the last incidents, did they? No, they didn't do anything. Their answer to that was bring in the canine dogs 2 weeks later and let's check staff. It's like the incidents that occur need immediate action. And we can talk till we're blue in the face and try to effectuate that change. But if you don't have the high level docs management supporting you, where do you go with that? And I believe that docs management right now, the only thing that they care about is recruitment. And recruitment is a problem, but let's get your head out of your ass and pay attention to everything. And you're kind of taking your eye off the ball, because you're probably a little scared that if you don't do something with recruitment, that you may not have a job next week. And nobody wants to see anyone lose their job, but we also don't want to see anybody lose their job because they're injured and can never work again. How about that? And we're headed to that problem. I won't say we're headed to that problem, because we already have. We just had another supervisors and officers that got injured and hurt pretty bad. And we talked about emergency surgery last week at a different facility. And the incidents just I get them almost daily, keep piling up. So it's just a matter of time when we lose a jail, when we lose a body, whether that be an incarcerated individual or an officer. And who's going to take responsibility for that? Nobody wants to be the person that says that I told you so. But at what depth do we go to try to deflect blame from the department? I'm not a subscriber to that theory, and I never will. Are they the only problem? No. But let's start with the problem. We can't change the law in an instant, because obviously the governor is not listening. The governor is out. It just came out, I think, in yesterday's newspaper, just about everywhere, with the new Siena poll. She has a lower public opinion rating than even Donald Trump in New York. And she's just her lowest numbers ever. And she was never popular. She never ever got to 50%. And there's a reason for that. Her way of thinking and not getting back to people and not helping and not listening to the stakeholders and agencies that need change and need her help. You can't ignore that. So docs does get blamed for that. The legislature gets blamed for their portion of HALT that we went into quite a bit of detail last week with the numbers of assaults both on incarcerated individuals and incarcerated individuals on staff. And I tie that directly to HALT. And I think the numbers statistically, DOC's own numbers support that theory as well. And they were told that that was going to happen, and still everybody wants to bury their head in the sand. So yes, it's the same mantra every week. It's the same people, and nothing has changed. So you keep asking yourself, for those that are working, is your working conditions better than they were last week? Are they better than they were last month? Are they better than they were, a year ago? I retired 4 years ago, and I thought it was bad then. That forced me to retire, and they're a hell of a lot worse today than they were back then. It's almost like refreshing to be like to be sad that you'd go back to 2000 in 20, and I thought that was bad and forced to retire. So I just can't wrap my head around the mentality. Like I said, there's all sides. I'm not giving anyone a pass. All sides are to blame. But what's more disturbing is that nobody's listening. And what happens when nobody's listening? When that frustration boils over, what happens? Who tells the families, all the time that when their family member is at the hospital or going home? You're hearing it live on the scanner, and people are spreading that, and family members hear that, and they're like, is it my family member next? Are they in the hospital? We've talked about in one of the very first podcasts about, the lieutenant and the charge sergeant going crazy because they're dealing with an incident. And, but they're also hearing through social media or the scanners that, an incident is happening. So the family knows how bad the working conditions are. That's why they're calling the facility to find out. They want to check on the loved ones because they know how bad it is. So when does it come to a point where somebody's listening? We're all advocating, as you saw Pat Vaccaro speak so eloquently about when he first started and trying to effectuate change, and he was able to do that. And so many of us have, through our careers, have effectuated change, helped members, done a lot of different things, and helping civilians and officers both inside and outside of work. There's a lot of good that goes on. But when you're looking at the working conditions that you're at right now and nobody's listening, how frustrating is that? What do you do? What do you do when nobody listens? And that's kind of where we're at today, because that's where the phone calls and the emails and the text messages that I field every day is, what do we do when nobody listens? And that's when you see people start to take matters into their own hands. Nobody wants that. And something has to change, and something has to change soon. So hopefully we can get there. Hopefully we are a collective voice and throughout the corrections society, meaning that, between the civilians, the officers and supervisors and management can all get on the same page and say, you know what, everybody, let's solve this problem once and for all. I don't see that happening anytime soon, because there's too many of the finger pointers. But everyone, it shouldn't be this instead of that. It shouldn't be the union solves the problem. It should be the union, the legislators, the department, the retirees, whoever. It should be everybody working together, not blaming this person or this instead of that. It should be everyone working in a cohesive group, and let's solve that problem. And we all have the same goal. I do believe that. I don't believe that certain legislators have the same goal, though I don't believe that they want to see any officers get hurt. But then again, after you've been showed statistic after statistic and nothing's changing, and you want to blame it on an IG report that says that it's not implemented properly, maybe they do want to see people in law enforcement get hurt. I don't have an answer for that. When you're hit in the face with statistics and facts, and you still deny, I don't have an answer for that part of it. So anyway, I don't want to leave on a more positive note, and let's get to some of the petitions. Again, we have the petition for the change in DOCCS. That goes directly to the governor. We'd like to see as many signatures on that as possible. And that's again at www.change.org/change _DOCCS for those that are on audio. If you have the video of the podcast, you see that at the bottom of your screen. And we'd like to get everybody to sign up and sign that petition, share it with your family, share it with your friends, share it with your neighbors, whoever you can possibly get, and get your message out. And also, the Attica Memorial was last week. So again, that's a sad day in history. We want to make sure that that situation never happens again in any line of correctional setting. And if we don't do something soon, we may see that again, unfortunately. So we want to wish everybody well, be safe out there. Remember to be kind to one another, because you never know what the person sitting next to you is going through. And keep the messages and the positive feedback coming as far as the podcast. Share that with others. It's available on all the major podcasts. The audio is on Audible, Spotify, iHeart, Apple, and what have you, Amazon, and just about every Apple podcast. So, and also we have the video version on YouTube streaming platforms. And again, we post it on, if you're part of the Facebook group, it's on the Facebook group. It's usually posted on the website too, as you see at the bottom of the screen, workinginhell.com. That's a new website that we started last week. So if you go there, you will see every episode of the podcast, both audio links and video links, as long with some other news clips and things that are going on, and ways to support the men and women of corrections. So we'll leave it at that. Again, it's Vinny Blasio, and thank you for joining the Working in Hell podcast. Have a good day, everyone.
You've been listening to the Working in Hell podcast with Vinny Blasio. Find this podcast on any of your favorite platforms like Audible, iHeart, and Spotify. And be sure to check out www.workinginhell.com for more information and important links. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.